I'm Selena Wang in San Francisco, and for Emily Chang, and this is Bloomberg Technology. Coming up in the next hour, Tesla shares stumble. The car maker announces it's cutting back on production of the Model X and Model S vehicles. Will profitability once again come under pressure for the company? Plus, Uber makes a splash at the World Economic Forum in Davos, giving new details about its self-driving car unit. We'll bring you the highlights of our conversation with CEO Daro Khosrowshahi. And China is set to become the world's biggest retail market this year, mainly thanks to growth in online spending. We explore why e-commerce remains strong in the region. But first, to our top story. Tesla shares have plummeted after the electric car maker announced it's reduced the number of hours it's producing Model 3 sedans and Model X crossovers. The move has added to concerns about demand for the Tesla's higher-priced and more profitable vehicles. Tesla has also gotten rid of the option for customers to order the vehicles equipped with entry-level batteries. Joining us now with more is Bloomberg's Dana Hull, who covers the company and broke this news. So, Dana, break down for us what exactly this means and what you've been hearing from your sources.
Sure. So workers at the Tesla factory last week were very concerned that layoffs were in the works because they had heard that production of Model S and X was going to be cut back. And then last Friday, Musk sent an email saying that he was laying off 7% of the workforce. The significance here is that this is the first time that the layoffs are actually hitting production workers, not just salaried like sales, HR, and marketing people, but people who actually work in the factory. So now we're hearing that, yeah, S and X production has been cut back. We don't know exactly how much. It's not that surprising because they did drop the lower priced model, and now all effort is on the Model 3.
I mean, is all of this a sign that the challenges of scaling up, selling at high prices, delivering large margins, is all of this coming to a head?
It seems to be. I mean, the Model S and X have been out for quite a while. The Model S first went into production in 2012, so it's a 7-year-old car. Most people who want a Model S have one already, and there's just the demand for those cars may not be as strong as it used to be, and the price difference between the lowest price Model S and the 3, it was not as wide, so that's why they dropped the 75 kilowatt version.
Right. In addition to the production cuts, they also had the pricing cut, so it seems that demand is coming to a ceiling?
Perhaps, yeah. And we'll find out more when Tesla reports earnings next week as to how many Model S's and X's do they plan to make this year. Is it still 100,000? Are they going to cut that back? We haven't gotten a lot of forward-looking guidance for the year.
And Musk said back in October that Europe and China might offset some of the slowdown in the U.S., but now we're seeing this economic slowdown in China, weak retail sales. Is this going to hurt that prediction he had?
Yeah, I mean, China has always been a wild card for Tesla because of the tariffs and the trade war, but Tesla is a strong brand. But now everyone is concerned about the Chinese auto market slowing down, and is Tesla going to be able to kind of swim through that or not? How fast are they going to get this Gigafactory up and running?
Right, we saw Apple really get hurt by China revenue forecasts. Is there a sense in Tesla that some of the growing nationalism in China, in addition to the economic slowdown, could hurt these numbers?
It could. I mean, I don't think we have a clear indication yet. I mean, Tesla got a very warm reception when it went to Shanghai for this Gigafactory groundbreaking. And so the sense is that they're actually racing to build this factory so that they could start producing there.
Right. How does that factory figure into all of this? I mean, you have job cuts here, production slowdown, and then you have this huge $5 billion plan in Shanghai.
Yeah, we still don't have a lot of details as to how that plant is being financed. The rumor was that it's largely through local Chinese debt, but we don't know the terms. We don't know which banks are involved. And then they have to build that plant in order to avoid the tariff issue, which makes the cars really cost prohibitive in China.
So we've had some recent very negative analyst reports on Tesla. You know, Tesla keeps on getting beat. Its shares keep on falling after each round of news. I mean, what's making investors most skittish right now?
I think for a long time, the Tesla narrative was that it's a growth company. It's a high growth company. They spend a lot, but they're growing because there's this like off the hook demand for their products. Now the demand question is really up for grabs because this is the first time that Tesla has actually pulled back on production.
And when we talk about production, how much of that layoff is actually increasing efficiency at Tesla, and how much of it is we just can't sell enough of these cars?
Well, that's a really good question. We don't have details from the state of California yet as to which positions were cut, but certainly production hours and production go hand in hand. On the one hand, like if you become incredibly efficient, you don't need as much labor, but you also don't need as much labor if you're not making as many cars.
And when you talk to sources who are still at the company, what is morale like?
It's pretty bad. I mean, in June, Elon Musk laid off 9%, saying that it was a hard decision, but he had to do it so that he would never have to do it again. 7 months later, he's laying off another 7%. And a lot of these people are folks who sort of, they made it through the first round of layoffs in June thinking that they were safe. They turned down other job opportunities. This came as a real surprise to people.
And in that announcement on the job cuts, Elon Musk said it's going to be a very difficult road ahead. I mean, what are some of the turning points we're expecting to see in 2019 for this company?
Well, they really need to get this $35,000 car, which they've been promising since March of 2016, out the door. And until that car is out, they're going to be in real trouble, because basically that's what people have been waiting for years. And they've sort of already sold the higher price version to everyone in the U.S. that they can.
All right, Dana Hull, great job breaking this news, and we'll be back to you for more. Now, Hulu is responding to Netflix's price hike by lowering the cost of a subscription. The on-demand video service has cut the price of its entry-level ad-supported product by 25% to just $6 a month. Remember, just last week, Netflix raised the cost of its most popular plan to $13 a month. Coming up, top tech leaders are gathering at the World Economic Forum in Davos this week to define priorities for the global industry. The top themes of this year's forum up next. And if you like Bloomberg News, check us out on the radio. You can listen on the Bloomberg app, Bloomberg.com, and in the U.S. on Sirius XM. This is Bloomberg. Investor Bill Smead says financial euphoria episodes are a common occurrence in the market. And when a new one comes along, participants accelerate their enthusiasm toward the end. In his latest note, Smead questions if today's big tech glam stocks peaked last year. He also questions if the current rally in shares of Netflix and Amazon could be part of the process of bottoming for an extended period, like the last tech euphoria episodes in the early 2000s. Joining us from Seattle, Bill Smead, Chief Executive and Chief Investment Officer of Smead Capital. Bill, let's talk about the recent decline in the popular tech stocks over these past 4 months. Is just this a temporary interruption in the long-term dominance of these stocks, of the U.S. economy and the indexes?
Well, you never know anything absolutely in the investment business. That's one of the beauties of it, is you make your money because you could look really foolish in 6 months. So let me take my best crack at it. The last time that tech dominated the stock market in the United States this much was in late 99 and early 2000. And in that prior 4 years, growth investments had outperformed value by 50%. Well, we got there 4 months ago. It's interesting that Amazon and Netflix and those folks topped out at the same spread that Microsoft and Cisco and Intel topped out back in late 99 and early 2000.
But what does this all mean for investors like yourself and asset allocators who need exposure to large U.S. equity tech stocks?
Well, if people paid some attention to what Jack Bogle said 3 or 4 months ago, it was starting to trouble him how much concentration of wealth had developed in the S&P 500 index and in ETFs that concentrate on tech and growth. Because what will happen, let's say you've got a cheap tech stock that you like now, and it's not one of the stocks that's part of the mania, but yet it's in the index, it's in the ETFs, and if the big name ones go into an extended bear market and stay depressed for an extended period of time, your shares are going to get net liquidated even though you're not part of the problem. So it could be quite an interesting fiasco if it is anything like what happened in 2000 through 2002.
And Bill, in your recent report, you spent a lot of time talking about dead stocks, which are stocks that may spend the next 10 years or more getting back to their euphoria peak time. So in your mind, What are the current dead stocks?
Well, it's funny. There's always two kinds of dead stocks in a mania. And again, I'm referring, we might not be the end of the mania, but for a long-term investor with a 5 to 10-year outlook, it will end by then unless all economic history is going to be rewritten. So the two kinds of dead stocks are the ones that their business ends up never being really great. They're the GeoCities, the AOLs, the total disasters out of the tech bubble, Simplicity Pattern and Kmart out of the Nifty 50 bubble in 1972. Those are dead, and they're not only dead, they're going to lose people a lot of money, and people are never going to have a chance to get it back. But I focused on the great companies, the ones that people have good reason for having a lot of long-term confidence in. So that would be the Coca-Colas and the Disneys and the McDonald's. And what you do is your stock gets smashed in the bear market, and then you go for like 10 to 20 years of purgatory where your stock never makes it back to the prices it was before the decline started. And in our piece that we wrote this week called We See Dead Stocks, we compared Intel, Cisco, and Microsoft to Amazon and Netflix and just asked that question. Microsoft was the big winner. They got back to their old high in 16 years from the peak. I think it was December 23rd of 1999, and they got back to the old high. 16 years of the stock going absolutely nowhere, not because the company didn't succeed, not because it's not a great company, not because they didn't have a great total addressable market, all because their stock had too much enthusiasm attached to it.
Bill, what about Amazon and Netflix? Have they already peaked?
If the history of the markets is any indication, on this decline from 2000 in Amazon, you see a lot of people going on TV and saying, hey, this is just a temporary correction, just like the corrections they've had all through the last 20 years that you should have bought, and it could double in 3 years and yada, yada, yada. Well, if you want a stock to bottom, you want all the analysts to cut their rating, you want everybody to go on TV and go, I never want to own this stock again, and you probably have a bottom. We're not there in any way, shape, or form in those stocks. In fact, in many ways, people are more excited about them than they were before they dropped.
And Bill, speaking of Netflix, Hulu recently lowered its prices after Netflix raised the prices. I mean, is this enough to improve Hulu's competitive positioning? I mean, how do you see the streaming competition shaking out?
Well, you don't want to get me started there. You know, the Disney Corporation and the Comcast Corporation, they've got 30 or 40 years of creating content. And I love this. These two Johnny-come-latelys come in and start producing content, and everyone knows that money only goes into Hollywood, it never comes out. So this idea that they're going to make all these wonderful shows like these companies that worked at it for 40 or 50 years, it might happen, but the problem is those stocks are priced as if that's not only going to happen, but they're going to grow to the sky on top of that.
Now, Amazon had surprisingly positive earnings. IBM did. Texas Instruments gave a weak forecast. What are your expectations for the upcoming big tech earnings like Apple, Amazon, Facebook, Google?
Well, it's a pretty good guess. If I'm running Apple and the stocks move from 220 down to 155 and a lot of people have bailed out, I'd shovel whatever bad news into this report I could put in there, right? Clean the slate for the following year. And what we're watching on Apple, by the way, Apple is depressed in price and looks reasonably priced. But what I want to see if the officers and directors are calling up their brokers or going into their online account and buying shares themselves and filing with the SEC. I don't want just Buffett buying it. I want to see them. And then in the case of Amazon and Netflix, it works just the reverse. In other words, it's almost more of a curse if their results are fantastic, because when you're trading at 80 times earnings, Coca-Cola's earnings were fantastic in 1972, and so were Disney's, but that didn't stop their PE ratio from contracting over the following 10 years. So, you know, who on the planet's left to love these? What analyst is left to tout them and raise their price target? There could be more out there, but it would surprise us.
Well, thanks so much, Bill Smead. I really enjoyed reading your report. We'll be on the lookout for the next one. CEO of Smead Capital Management, thanks again for joining. The World Economic Forum is underway in Davos, Switzerland, and tech is at the center of conversation. Top tech executives, including Facebook's Sheryl Sandberg and Uber's Dara Khosrowshahi, joined several world leaders to address global problems, from transportation to regulation. Bloomberg senior executive editor of global technology Brad Stone sent us this report earlier from Davos.
Transportation was on the agenda at the World Economic Forum in Davos this week. I sat down for a panel discussion with Uber CEO Dara Khosrowshahi, UPS CEO David Abney, and Boeing CEO Dennis Muilenburg. There were no regulators on the panel, so all three CEOs were able to wax optimistically about the future of mobility. We talked about autonomous driving, air taxis, drones, and the Hyperloop. All three CEOs are eager to change how people view their companies and to bring new solutions to moving around within cities and between cities and around the world to their customers. It's difficult to pinpoint one consistent theme when it comes to technology at the World Economic Forum in Davos this week. The topics of panel discussions have ranged widely, from the impact of facial recognition technologies to privacy in the digital age to the demographics of the gig workforce. Of course, Davos always provides an opportunity for CEOs to signal their virtues and to talk about their passions. Mark Benioff of Salesforce is here talking about the responsibility he believes CEOs have to give back to the community. Bill Gates is here talking about his objectives in terms of global health. Sheryl Sandberg is here at Davos talking about the way in which she thinks publishers can succeed on the Facebook ecosystem. Last year at Davos, there was the clear sense that tech CEOs were here to apologize for the impact that they had on democracy. This year, there's a prevailing sense, I believe, that the world's problems, dysfunction in Washington, D.C., the Brexit stalemate in the UK, that the world's problems have eclipsed the problems of Silicon Valley. This is Brad Stone from Bloomberg reporting from the World Economic Forum in Davos.
Much more coming up. And as a reminder, Bloomberg Technology is live streaming on Twitter. Check us out at Technology and be sure to follow our global breaking news network at TikTok on Twitter. This is Bloomberg. Open source event streaming platform Confluent joined Silicon Valley's Unicorn Club on Tuesday, announcing a $125 million in Series D funding. The latest round, led by Sequoia Capital, with participation from Index Ventures and Benchmark, brings the company to a $2.5 billion valuation. Confluent works with companies like Audi, JP Morgan, and Priceline to transport massive volumes of data to and between their applications. Here to discuss more is Index Ventures general partner Mike Volpe. Now, Mike, for a long time, investors really ignored this category of open source software because they just couldn't get past the free part.
Yeah.
So what's exactly changed?
The companies have really changed. The early open source models were really about mostly taking free software and selling support services. So if something broke or went wrong, you would call somebody up and they'd tell you how to get out of a jam. But modern open source companies are actually more open core, which means that some part of the software is free, but some part of it is commercial and paid for. And the parts that are paid for tend to be the features that large corporations need to use in order to operationalize their software. And that's created a whole new revenue model for these open source companies.
Is Confluent profitable?
It is not yet.
Now, what exactly does Confluent do, and how does it compare to other startups in the space and Amazon, which has a competing product?
Sure. I mean, the basic idea is that 10 years ago, companies ignored data. Today, data is the lifeblood of companies. It's how fundamentally decisions are made all the time. Mm-hmm. The tricky part is data is created everywhere in an enterprise. Every time you tap a mobile app, every time you step on the accelerator in a car, you're creating data. And then lots of different parts of organizations need that data to do their job. So a product designer might need to know how often you push that accelerator. A marketer may want to know how frequently you click on your mobile app. Those people in the company need to have that data. Something needs to connect the two. And if you connect everything one by one, you get this big giant mess of spaghetti of data inside your corporation. And Confluent, if you will, are the roadways that connect the creators of data, the publishers, and the subscribers that receive that data to analyze it and understand what's actually happening.
Now, open source software has been a very hot space for M&A. We had Red Hat, IBM, MuleSoft was acquired after it went public. Are you expecting to see more of that?
I don't know necessarily if you're going to see more M&A, but you are going to see a lot more primetime open source companies. And I think the fundamental reason is that because the software, or at least part of the software, is visible and free, corporations that are customers trust that they don't have lock-in anymore. Unlike the old days of Oracle or Microsoft, where the software was closed and you had to buy it for them for software, that openness gives a level of comfort. And also you have an entire community behind it creating and innovating. So rather than being purely focused on the employees of that one provider of software, you have a community around it, and therefore the pace of development is much quicker. So you're seeing this open source momentum really drive across many applications in the enterprises.
And 2018 was a very successful year for Index as a whole. Several exits like Adyen, Dropbox, Sonos. What's in the pipeline for 2019?
Well, we have to be a little bit quiet about what's in the pipeline. We have a few companies that are exciting. Slack is one of them that's been talked about a lot. We have a company called Datadog that's in the data monitoring business. That's quite mature. Confluent itself is an excellent company that's growing quickly. So we're lucky enough to have a good portfolio right now. We're excited about this year.
And on the note of Slack, why go for a direct listing versus an IPO? And what's the timing on that?
Well, we can't talk about timing specifically or whether the company is deciding to do something one way or the other. But generally, the idea of a direct listing is relatively interesting for a certain type of company. Obviously, that direct listing means you don't go through an underwriting process and you sell the shares directly to the public. There's no lockups. There's no dilution. So for a company that's cash rich, like a Spotify, which did it last year, and also has high brand recognition, so they don't need the benefit of that big road show that you do in the IPO, direct listings are useful. And then there's a number of companies right now that have matured, who have that same cash richness, that same brand recognition, that could potentially utilize direct listings as a good way to go public.
And we're seeing the government shut down, delay IPOs for some companies. Uber and Lyft are expected to go public early this year. Are you seeing that impact your portfolio at all?
In tech, not so much. Most companies that go public either don't need cash at all or just need it for a rainy day, for insurance, for M&A or something like that. So if your business is not particularly cash hungry, like all these companies that were mentioned fit into that category, I don't think going public this month or next month is a rush. And you have to assume that at some point, politics allowing, the government will figure it out and the markets will reopen.
And lastly, what do you see as the biggest risk factor to the tech sector this year? Is it regulation? Is it geopolitical concerns?
Look, at the end of the day, as much as we love tech, it's a byproduct of the general economy. If the general economy is doing well, people will spend more and more money on tech. If the economy slows down, that's challenging. So if you look at the global economy right now, the two big powers, the U.S. and China, U.S. economy right now is in great shape. So I expect that to continue. China's a little softer, so you worry about it a little bit. Most startups don't sell a lot to China. So right now, at least the prospects look pretty good.
All right, Mike Volpe, General Partner, thanks for joining. We'll be coming back to you for more on Slack. And coming up, a new report from eMarketer outlines why China's e-commerce growth is still booming despite an economic slowdown in the region. This is Bloomberg. Technology Global Link, where we join Daybreak Australia to bring you the latest in global tech news. I'm Selena Wang in San Francisco.
And I'm Hadi Stradwatz in Sydney.
And I'm Sharon Yan in Washington, D.C. Let's get a take at the top global tech stories of the day. China has scrubbed the web of more than 700 websites since January 3rd, deleting more than 9,300 smartphone apps for information deemed inappropriate or harmful. Tencent's news service was singled out for spreading vulgar and lowbrow content. Microsoft says it's planning to implement self-designed ethical principles for its facial recognition technology by the end of March. It's also urging government to push ahead with matching regulation in the field, calling for new legislation. The company is specifically focused on human review and oversight of the technology in some critical cases, including intrusions into privacy and democratic freedoms. And the French government is aiming to ensure the security of its 5G network without banning Chinese equipment supplier Huawei. This is according to a French lawmaker involved with drafting the regulation. Huawei is angling for full-scale commercialization of 5G networks by 2020. And those are the top global tech stories today. Selena, back to you in San Francisco.
Now, China will edge out the U.S. as the biggest retail market in the world this year, according to a new forecast by research firm eMarketer. And online sales are a big part of China's growth. More than 35% of the country's retail sales in 2019 are estimated to be from e-commerce. For more, we're joined by Andrew Lipsman, principal analyst at eMarketer in Chicago. Now, Andrew, China is outpacing retail sales in the U.S. despite the trade war, the broader economic slowdown. How much is that dampening this, and what's offsetting that?
Sure. Well, it's certainly dampening our forecast a bit. Now, we saw retail growth in excess of 8% last year, so we're bringing that down in our forecast to about 7.5%, but that's still going to run ahead of GDP growth, and certainly that's a strong growth rate on a very large number for China. A big part of what's driving it is the continuing growth of the middle class there, particularly in Tier 3 markets and more rural areas as those consumers come online and engage in e-commerce for the first time.
And a great deal of that still has to do with mobile penetration, right? I mean, at what point do we start to see some semblance of, I guess, saturation when it comes to retail sales online in China?
Yeah, so I mean, about $1 out of every $3 in retail would be transacted online. What's incredible is that we'll see that number for mobile commerce surpass 80% this year. So 8 out of $10 in the U.S., we're at about half of that percentage. So really, that's fueling a lot of the growth that we're seeing. And if you just look at mobile in the context of all of retail, it's going to push upwards to about 30% of all spending.
I spoke to Alibaba President Mike Evans late last year, and he mentioned that big ticket items are slowing on the platform, but other areas like cosmetics, fashion, and apparel are still going strong. Is that a broader trend that you're seeing in e-commerce in China?
Yeah, I think obviously with trying to rein in the credit in China, that's going to affect big ticket purchases. You know, we saw some of the slowdown in the smartphone market already. So I think that that's something that's obviously of concern and can certainly push up those growth numbers quite a bit. We're seeing the U.S. being bolstered by high ticket purchases in e-commerce. I think the reverse is actually happening here in China now.
You know, for the longest time, it feels like these e-commerce behemoths like Alibaba have had a bit of a head-scratching moment when it comes to international expansion and how to replicate a very structurally, domestically Chinese phenomenon elsewhere in the world, right? But I want to pull up this graphic that I found really intriguing in terms of Chinese internet users outnumbering, in fact, more than double the entire U.S. population. So I'm wondering if you look at statistics like this, you know, do these companies in China actually need overseas markets?
I think they can certainly grow to be huge. In fact, we're forecasting that Alibaba's gross merchandise value in 2019 is going to surpass $1 trillion, which is really incredible to think about. Now, obviously, that doesn't all fall into their revenue, but a huge amount of volume that's happening through these platforms. Do they need the other markets? No, but if they want continued growth and expansion, they are going to want exposure to these markets. And we've seen with a lot of Chinese internet companies, you know, they can expand somewhat into other parts of Asia, Southeast Asia, but it gets harder and harder as you start thinking about other markets in Europe and in North America.
And Andrew, the data shows that these smaller players are really starting to eat into Alibaba and JD's businesses. If you take a look at this chart, you'll see that Pinduoduo reached almost $70 billion in sales in 2018. So what are these smaller players doing that Alibaba and JD are not?
Yeah, no, all the players, even Alibaba, is going to grow at almost 20% this year. So the market as a whole is growing, but it is eating into Alibaba's share. Pinduoduo is a really interesting example. It's almost like Groupon on steroids, and took this kind of group buying phenomenon and translated into this rural and Tier 3 market that is growing so quickly. So they're very well aligned with the fastest growing segment of the population for the e-commerce market. And you know, that's really fueled really incredible growth. To think about the fact that the company was founded in 2015, just a few years ago, and is already going to take 7% of the e-commerce market in China almost overnight.
And Andrew, lastly, despite the broader economic slowdown in China and growing nationalism there, are you still seeing retailers internationally want to double down in that market to reach those large growing middle class consumers that you were just talking about?
It's always a double-edged sword. I think that the complexity of going into China can always be difficult, and every company kind of wants to go into that market, but when they actually try and do it, they often find that it's a little bit more difficult than they had anticipated, and you often see these pullbacks. So they're going to continue to try. I don't know how successful all of them will be, and so we'll have to see what happens there.
Andrew, what's the next big thing that we're not already talking about in this space?
Well, I think Pinduoduo is maybe a good example of something that's new and novel and has taken off. And so what I'm wondering is, are we going to see some more of these new flavors of retail, not just that targets this segment, but that almost kind of brings in some of these gimmicks to precipitate a new form of buying. So that's what I'm looking at. Usually you get these followers when you have a real success story. So what's the next one that's going to take shape? Is it going to take shape in China, or are we going to see copycats in other parts of the world?
Andrew, appreciate your time with us. Andrew Lipsman with eMarketer there joining us. Thank you very much. Well, much more coming up here on Bloomberg. This is Bloomberg.
It's been a difficult Q4. I mean, you can see the result of our peers who have announced volatile markets. Although things have gotten better since the beginning of the year, 2019 has started better. For us, it vindicates everything we've been doing for 3 years.
Amazon, in a move to improve its delivery service, will test a fleet of robots in the Seattle suburbs. The e-commerce giant announced a trial of Amazon Scout, an autonomous delivery device the size of a cooler that rolls along sidewalks at a walking pace. At the moment, it will use 6 robots, which are designed to navigate around obstacles such as people and pets. And as the world's population tops 7 billion people, more importance is being placed on how to identify and track people around the globe. A new report from McKinsey outlines the benefits of adopting a digital ID, which can impact government benefits, healthcare, financial services, and jobs. Here to discuss, Olivia White, partner at McKinsey and company and lead author of this report. So, Olivia, break down for us what exactly is a digital ID and what are its objectives?
Sure. Well, you know, in a place like the U.S., it's very easy to take identification for granted. But if you go to developing countries, there are roughly 1 billion people who have no form of legal identification. That means they can't interact with their governments. They can't open a bank account. If they wanted to start a business or register it, they couldn't. And probably 4 to 5 billion people in the world have ID, but that don't give full functionality. And even, I don't know for you or me, I forget passwords regularly. I've forgotten 2 passwords this week, and it's hard sometimes to interact with companies. So what we wanted to do was to say, look, given those challenges, what's the benefit of an identification that can allow you to identify yourself via digital channels in a high authentication way?
It would certainly make all of our lives easier to not have to remember a million passwords on a million different sites, but it has been implemented, this digital ID program, in certain countries, but it's had pretty mixed results. So where has it been successfully done?
Well, you know, I would say it's at the early stages, so that's the reason for mixed results. But if you look at a country like Estonia on the small side, small country, but they've got all of their population essentially using a digital ID. On the larger side, India has got 1.2 billion people right now on a digital identification system.
And in your research on 7 countries, extending full digital ID coverage could unlock economic value equivalent to 3 to 13% of GDP. So how exactly does that economic value creation happen?
Yeah, well, so we looked at 7 countries across the developed and developing world. We looked at Brazil, China, Ethiopia, Nigeria, the US, and the UK. And you see that across all of those countries, there are really 6 kinds of ways in which individuals interact and where value can be created through hundreds of use cases. So one is I interact as a consumer with a company. Another is I interact as a worker with my employee. Another is I've got a micro enterprise and I want to start a business. Sometimes I'll interact as a taxpayer or a beneficiary with my government, or I'll just be a citizen.
Now, India's digital national ID program, which is actually the world's largest, was recently shown to be compromised. So what are some of the greatest risks here when it comes to privacy, identity fraud?
Yeah, no, well, this is an incredibly important question because, you know, on the one hand, there's this potential for enormous good that can be unlocked by digital ID. But there are risks, too, and there's actually even the risk of misuse. In some ways, digital ID can be thought of as a dual-use technology, something like nuclear energy, where there's potential to unleash a huge amount of potential value, but there's also potential for downside if it's in the wrong hands. And as a result, things like the proper governance, the right legal framework, and really very careful controls and rules around privacy and user consent are incredibly important and are precisely the things needed to allow the benefit to be realized.
Right, some critics have called digital IDs one of the gravest risks to human privacy and identity.
Yeah.
So how do governments limit that downside? Could technologies like blockchain help?
Well, sure. You know, what governments need to look at here for ID, as for the full digital world, are very similar. You know, there are lots of governments that are currently working, as in the UK, or say even here as in California, at the right ways to set up legal frameworks around how data can be shared and also what sort of consent people need to give in order to get those benefits. Technologies like blockchain can help, but they're distinctly not the solution alone. You really need the legal framework and the right governance.
And what are some of the differences in the way that emerging economies versus developed economies should implement these programs? Or is it expected that developing economies will leapfrog? Emerging economies will leapfrog the developing ones?
It's a tremendous opportunity for leapfrogging in developing countries because they're going from places where you really have, it would give you a statistic, 45% of women in low-income countries don't have a legal form of identification.
Wow.
Compared to 30% of men in those same countries. So you have this huge gender gap. You often have instances in which just not enough people are included. And digital ID provides this mechanism for really inclusive growth and allowing people newly, in many ways, access to the digital world.
And how will some of these biometric technologies, like improving facial recognition, fingerprint scanning, iris scanning?
Mm-hmm. Well, the technology answer to that is they're getting cheaper, they're getting better at reducing false positives and false negatives, better at making sure they're really identifying the right person. But those technologies, as we were talking about earlier, really need to go along with the right protections for their use.
And in what countries have you seen a sort of private and public partnership really help to achieve this digital identity program?
Yeah, well, Estonia is a really interesting and good example on the one hand, because the government in many ways is the real driver, but what they do enables and elicits the participation of the private sector tremendously. You then have a country like Sweden. In Sweden, like Sweden. So in Sweden, there's an identification program that was started by a consortium of banks that have worked together to establish this program that's then used also for certain sorts of public purposes.
All right, Olivia White, fascinating report from McKinsey & Company. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And still ahead, venture capital faces its diversity gap head on. How the founders of All Raise want to take on Silicon Valley's boys club and put more women in VC. This is Bloomberg. A drone that prompted the federal government to briefly shut down Newark Liberty International Airport flew within about 30 feet of a jetliner, triggering hours of delays. A pilot on a Southwest Airlines flight first reported the device as he was landing the plane. A crew on a second flight operated by United Airlines made a similar report 3 minutes later. In 2017, just 15% of all venture funding went to female founders. That's according to All Raise, a nonprofit organization dedicated to diversity and funders and founders. Their mission is to increase that number to 25% while doubling the percentage of female partners in venture firms in the next 10 years. Bloomberg's Emily Chang sat down with founders Maha Ibrahim, Kirsten Green, and Eileen Lee on Studio 1.0 and asked about tariffs affecting VC strategy, Facebook's leadership, and regulation in technology.
The tariffs that our government has put in place are, in the long term, and maybe this is my economist background speaking a little bit more, they are ruinous for our economy. They are ruinous for the global economy, and even when I look at our micro little world in Silicon Valley, when we think about prices going up, both for direct goods and the supplied goods, the components effectively, it is just, these are unnecessary price changes that the only beneficiary of that is, frankly, nobody that needs to have that money. I do believe that the tariffs that have been put in place are anti-capitalism. And will, in the long term, negatively affect GDP around the world.
I wonder if some of these companies have also shot themselves in the foot. I mean, if you look at a company like Facebook, is the damage self-inflicted?
I think the consumer response or sentiment around Facebook, I guess one opportunity is it creates windows for new startups. Because, you know, if there's a startup that's going to promise certain things around privacy or your data, and you can share, and I think we've learned a lot about social media in the past 5 or 10 years, that, you know, this is part of the cycle of creation and destruction or evolution in technology, is that you learn from the predecessors and then people come up with new products.
Mark Zuckerberg and Sheryl Sandberg have been scrutinized for their leadership. Where do you think they went wrong?
I mean, it's pursuing dollars at any cost at the end of the day, right? They were willing to, whether it's them or whether it's people under them, I have no idea, right? I mean, that's for you to pick out as journalists. But I think they were willing to sacrifice a lot of their principles for the almighty dollar and share price.
So Sheryl Sandberg specifically has been heavily criticized for, you know, whatever shortcomings she may have had. Do you think that criticism has been fair, or do you think that criticism has been disproportionate?
I think in many sectors of society, we are witnessing how women are treated and viewed differently in the public media than men are treated.
So you think she's getting criticized more because she's a woman?
I mean, I think obviously it's not binary, right? Because she is the chief business officer of the company, and there are a lot of business issues that or business decisions and policy decisions that are fall under her purview. But I think if you look at politics in particular right now, and you look at how females in office are being viewed by the media or by the public versus men, there's clearly a double standard, and I think the same is true in business.
Where are the double standards? If Elon Musk can talk to the New York Times and cry in an interview.
Or smoke during an interview. Yep.
Can women do that?
No.
No.
What do you think? Oh, I mean,
that's why I'm asking.
Yeah. Hashtag funding secured. Why not?
It's not okay, but I think, like, realistically, we're on a continuum of kind of integrating women into different roles and different businesses. And like, while we're on a path to carving that opportunity out, we're held to a higher standard.
Well, and I wonder if we're doing this to our detriment, society's detriment, the detriment of these companies. Like Marissa Mayer, who was so picked apart, where is she now?
There has to be an acknowledgement that we are not all uniform, right? That one woman does not equal the next, does not equal the next.
Right?
We are all very different. Our investment styles are very different. Our personalities are very different. That doesn't mean that we can't come together and produce something that is excellent and where we can succeed. In fact, that means that we can come together and do great things.
And the other thing that I think has changed in the past year that I'm excited about is I'm starting to see, I think we're all seeing more men stand up and call these things out, right? I think it's exciting to see more men willing to stand up and say what they think about these issues.
I mean, there's talk of Amazon needing regulation. Like, are you concerned about regulation for tech? Could that hurt?
When I think about it from a business perspective and from a consumer perspective, I don't want to live in a world where there's 5 choices for everything. Like, it's not enough. It's not going to be as interesting, and I don't think it's ultimately going to be good for us. And so if you go back to kind of like, why do the regulations exist? Why does the antitrust law exist? I mean, as I understand it, it's to protect the consumer, right? And so I think it's your definition of what's protecting the consumer. It's been about price and access, and so like I think that's where it's kind of, we're running into some interference around kind of how those companies, if they interfere with that. But I think maybe that needs to be re-explored about kind of what are the standards that govern the way we think about when a company is too big.
Are you at all concerned that because of a macroeconomic slowdown that funding could dry up?
I am concerned about that. I believe that is why a lot of companies raised the capital that they did in 2018. I think fear, as opposed to greed, was driving a lot of the large capital raises, and that people were feeling like this party has to end at some point in time. The problem is, or the benefit is, I don't really see the party ending. There is still a huge amount of cash in the system that is looking for returns. They're not getting it on the stock market. They're not getting it in
it's a fund
emerging
flows.
markets.
Yeah.
It's a fund flow. It's a macro fund flows issue. It will go towards high beta, high innovation, high potential return, and that's venture.
That was Emily Chang's interview with Maha Ibrahim, general partner at Canaan, Kirsten Green, founding partner of Forerunner Ventures, and Eileen Lee, founder and partner at Cowboy Ventures. You can watch the full episode of Bloomberg Studio 1.0 tonight at 9:30 p.m. Eastern, 6:30 p.m. Pacific. That does it for this edition of Bloomberg Technology. On tomorrow's show, we'll bring you an exclusive interview with Priscilla Chan, founder of Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, on the foundation's newest enterprise to improve housing in San Francisco. And Bloomberg Technology is live streaming on Twitter. Check us out at Technology, and be sure to follow our global breaking news network at TikTok on Twitter. This is Bloomberg.